Our topic is on the Philippine-American War. This war took place in November of 1899. The Philippine-American War gave the United States some control of the Philippines. The reason why the Philippines began this war was because they wanted to have freedom, and the U.S. rebuffed that idea. At the beginning, the Philippines' first plan was to earn independence from Spain, and the U.S. helped them achieve that. After that, the Philippines wanted to earn independence from the U.S. as well, but they did not want the Philippines to do so. That's when the Philippines felt a sign of betrayal. The Filipinos were furious about this incident, and it caused a war between them and the United States. The result from the war led to many deaths, and it caused a very tragic event. This war persisted for about 3 years. More than 20,000 Filipino soldiers died from this, and over 4,200 American combatants died as well. About 200,000 Filipinos died from violence and diseases. The first official ruler at the time was Emilio Aguinaldo. Emilio accomplished independence for his country from Spain, and his next plan was to obtain independence from the U.S. Emilio was qualified to be the first official president of the Philippines because he fought for freedom and the independence of the Philippines. During the year 1901, Emilio was captured by the Americans, and that led to the Philippines getting a new president, Manuel L. Quezon. The American president at that time of the war was Theodore Roosevelt. He was the 26th president and was known for being the youngest president of the United States. As I mentioned before, this war persisted for about 3 years. It ended in the year 1902. The Filipinos did not earn their independence right when the war was over. It took several years for the United States to grant them independence. The Philippines finally accomplished their goal in the year 1946 of getting independence, and Emilio made peace with the U.S.
The United States easily wins the Battle of Manila Bay on May 1, 1898, effectively ending Spanish colonization of the Philippines. Rather than granting independence to the Philippines, the United States betrayed the Filipino people because of racism and the pro-imperialism rhetoric of United States leaders like Theodore Roosevelt, Albert Beveridge, and the Metropolitan Club.
Our project integrates with the History Fair theme, Debate and Diplomacy in History, because our topic is on the Philippine-American War, and how it is about the Filipinos demanding independence from the Americans, and in that case, the Americans do not like the sound of that idea. Emilio Aguinaldo, the president of the Filipinos at that time, demanded war in 1899. Theodore Roosevelt, the president of the Americans at that time, agreed to this. The two countries both had two very different, distinct opinions and thoughts on the situation. On the Philippines side, they wanted independence, but on the other hand, the USA's side wanted control over the Philippines. Each side had a discrete perspective and view on this situation. In conclusion, the Filipinos and Americans were arguing, and that showed an example of debate. They continuously disagreed, and that caused them to go to war. The Philippine-American War connected to diplomacy because they negotiated and finally agreed with each other to declare the end of the war in 1902. The Filipinos were very pleased with the result of this. Their president, Emilio Aguinaldo, was especially pleased with this as well. This topic can relate to diplomacy because of how they negotiated to give the Philippines freedom. Also, how the Philippines earned their culture, region, and their alphabet from this. China, Spain, and America impacted Filipino culture heavily. Before all of this, the Philippines had a culture that was combined with Asian, European, and American. That being said, after the 3 years, 1899 to 1902, of the Philippine-American War, they communicated with each other for many years to finally find a solution for the Philippines' freedom. In 1946, they had an agreement to allow the Philippines to gain and claim the freedom they deserved.
The first piece of evidence to prove our thesis was how the United States easily won the Battle of Manila Bay. The kinds of sources that we used as evidence to develop and prove our thesis are different types of videos, photographs, and documentaries. For this specific statement, we used an article found on Britannica called Battle of Manila Bay, Spanish-American War in 1899, which was a secondary source, to determine why and how the U.S. won the Battle of Manila Bay without any effort. The Battle of Manila Bay, which took place on May 1, 1898, was also known as the Battle of Cavite. The Battle of Manila Bay was a battle between the United States and the Spaniards. The Manila Bay was one of the first ever engagements of the Spanish-American War. During the period of the battle, there was no official president in the Philippines and there wasn't a strong government. A year after the Battle of Manila Bay, Emilio Aguinaldo became the president of the Philippines. Emilio Aguinaldo was the first president and he truly wanted the best for the Philippines. On the other hand, the President of the United States during the Battle of Manila Bay was William McKinley. The leader of this battle was George Dewey. On top of that, George Dewey was also scheduled to lead the U.S. Asiatic Squadron. The U.S. Asiatic Squadron is Asian armies or squads. The reason the United States effortlessly won the battle against the Spanish was because the Spanish forces did not expect the U.S. to go into battle with them. It was a very sudden action from Dewey. George Dewey led an attack on the ships in Manila Bay because he wanted the United States to be in control of the Philippines rather than the Spanish forces. That being said, with the Spaniards not knowing about the battle, they didn't have the certain weapons and equipment to win against the United States. The Spanish were unprepared, causing them to lose against the U.S. This is an example of what an ambush is. The United States struck the Spaniards right when they least expected it. The United States sunk the Spaniards' boats. This evidence supports the thesis because it gives an explanation on how the U.S. won the Battle of Manila Bay so easily.
The Philippines felt a sign of betrayal by the United States. The United States betrayed and backstabbed the Filipinos. A quote states, "Let us also not forget the times the old US of A wrecked, backstabbed, and bamboozled the Philippines." Filipinos were frustrated by the betrayal of the United States for the reason that the U.S. supported and helped them get independence and sovereignty from the Spaniards. Then they turned their back on the Filipinos. The reason this was a sign of betrayal was because their way of doing so was to acquire control over the Philippines, first in order to terminate the colonization from the Spanish because they thought the Filipinos were not capable of maintaining their own country. Americans committed tons of war crimes against the Filipinos. The most damaging, bloody war that concerns many in the U.S. is known as the Forgotten War, estimating an amount with 20,000 to 35,000 Filipino combatants dying in the dispute. With the result of the suffering, there were more than 200,000 to 1 million deaths. The Americans falsely claimed that they were going to grant independence to the Philippines. Not only did America betray the Philippines, they had lied to the Philippines. Emilio Aguinaldo wanted the best for his country and wanted the Philippines to earn their independence and not be colonized by any other country. So he gave them a chance so they could possibly achieve the independence that they have been wanting for so long. Aguinaldo did not give up on trying to get independence for his country. He was extremely determined to earn it. This shows his commitment to being the president of the Philippines. He truly cared about his country and wanted the best for it and the people. The Philippine-American War took place in November of 1899 and ended in 1902. The Philippines did not earn independence right after the war ended. It took them several years too. The Americans finally agreed to grant them independence on July 4th, 1946.
To prove that the United States enslaved the Filipinos, we used many sources including articles, videos, and more. The most important resource we used to prove this unfair act was an article called The Hunting Story of Filipinos Locked in a Human Zoo. This article focuses on the fact that the United States thought they were superior to the rest of the world. The result of this was that the Filipinos were mistreated and the United States took advantage of them. The Americans thought that the Filipinos were animals and thought it was a good idea to display them in what they called a human zoo. They took tribesmen without anyone's consent and brought them into a new environment far away from their new homeland, as if it was no big deal. The Filipinos had no say in this action, and the Americans didn't care for the reason that they had more power. The United States were very selfish and did this for their own entertainment. In another article called 10 Fascinating Pinot Vintage Photos, it shows this mechanism that strangles a person. It is called a garrote and it has a metal collar which strangles your neck. This collar was made from a handheld chain, rope, or iron. which was common in the Philippines. The garrote was one of the ways the United States killed the Filipinos. The Filipinos were forced to get into the mechanism and they were taken by the United States. This proves that the United States enslaved the Philippines because the U.S. made it obligatory for the Filipinos to do whatever the U.S. said or wanted them to do. The Philippine-American War was referred as to the race war. Race did play a role in the war. To sum everything up, America treated the Filipinos terribly, and there is no excuse to make it seem acceptable.
In conclusion, the United States colonization of the Philippines was a betrayal of the Filipino people. Despite all of it, the Filipinos did not stop fighting for freedom, did not give up their claims of independence. After years of conflict and bloodshed, Emilio Aguinaldo remained determined to fight for their country's independence. For example, the United States won the Battle of Manila Bay without any effort because the Americans were more prepared for the battle and they had more advanced weapons.
Another example is how the Filipinos felt like they were betrayed by the Americans, and it was because they thought they earned each other's trust. Also, how the United States assured the Filipinos that they would help them get freedom from the Spaniards, but then turned their back on the Filipinos instead. And the last example was that the United States enslaved the Philippines by taking tribesmen far away from their home and storing them in a human zoo for the Americans to gawk at, and this human zoo was located in New York.